We feel the company needs to move in a more dynamic direction, David. The words hung in the sterile air of the conference room, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and corporate cowardice. Kyle Sterling, all of 32 years old and 6 months into his role as CEO, leaned back in his leather chair, a picture of smug satisfaction. He looked at me like I was a piece of old furniture he was finally getting around to replacing, an outdated fixture. My name is David Brennan. I'm 48 years old. For the last 19 years, 7 months and 3 days, I was the senior project manager at Sterling Construction, the firm his uncle, Arthur Sterling, had built from the ground up with his bare hands and my unwavering support. I managed their 5 largest accounts, the bedrock of the entire company. Kyle gestured vaguely with a hand, adorned with a watch that cost more than my first year of college tuition. It's about optimizing our legacy assets and pivoting toward a more agile, data-driven client interface. He was speaking a language he'd learned at Wharton, a dialect designed to say nothing while sounding important. What he meant was, "You're old, and I want your job." He wanted the glory of the accounts I had spent 2 decades building, relationship by painstaking relationship. He thought they were just names on a spreadsheet he could inherit, like he inherited the CEO chair. He was wrong. The HR director, a woman named Janice, who had always been kind to me, refused to make eye contact. She slid a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany table. My severance package. A calculated insult. The minimum required by law. Kyle continued his monologue, something about a strategic leadership realignment. I didn't listen. My focus narrowed to the faint tremor in his hand as he picked up his ridiculously expensive Mont Blanc pen. He was nervous. Good. He had no idea what was coming. He saw a 48-year-old man in a suit that was 5 years out of style. He saw a loyal employee who had never asked for a raise he hadn't earned tenfold. He didn't see the architect of his company's success. More importantly, he didn't see the architect of its impending collapse. "Security will escort you out," he finished, the final petty twist of the knife. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate. I didn't look at the envelope. I looked directly at Kyle. My voice was steady, measured. "I understand." 2 words. That was all he got. As the 2 security guards, men I knew by name, fell in step behind me, I allowed myself a single fleeting thought. Kyle had read a lot of business books. He had a framed MBA on his wall, but he'd never bothered to read the contracts. Specifically, Section 8, Subsection C, the Key Personnel Clause. If you appreciate stories about competence trumping arrogance, about the quiet guys finally getting their due, hit that like button and subscribe. You're in the right place, because this isn't a story about me getting fired. It's a story about what happened next. I joined Sterling Construction in the fall of 2005. I was 29, fresh out of a 6-year stint with the Army Corps of Engineers. The company was just Arthur Sterling, his secretary, and a handful of site supervisors. Our office was a double-wide trailer on the edge of a muddy lot that would one day become our first major project. Arthur was a force of nature, a man who believed a handshake was a binding contract and that your word was your most valuable asset. He hired me not for my resume, but because I looked him in the eye and told him I wasn't afraid of hard work. Those first few years were a blur of 80-hour weeks. I was the project manager, the procurement officer, the surveyor, and sometimes the guy holding the shovel. We poured concrete in freezing rain and framed buildings in the blistering Texas sun. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, and my daughter Sarah's 8th grade graduation. I watched her walk across the stage on a grainy video feed from a construction trailer in Dubai, a lump in my throat, because the Meridian Group deal had a deadline that couldn't be moved. That was the sacrifice. You do it because you believe you're building something. For your family. For the company. And we did build something. We took Sterling from a $3 million local outfit to a $250 million regional powerhouse. The foundation of that growth wasn't clever marketing or financial engineering. It was the 5 pillars, the 5 clients I brought in and nurtured until they were more than clients. They were partners. Apex Development, run by the formidable Mr. Chen. Omnicorp, a logistics giant. Vanguard Properties, the biggest commercial landlord in the state. The Meridian Group, an international hotel chain. And Titan Industries, a manufacturing behemoth. Together, they represented over 60% of Sterling's annual revenue. These weren't accounts won by a slick sales team. They were won in muddy trenches and late-night phone calls, by solving impossible problems and delivering on every single promise, no matter the cost. I knew the names of my clients' children, their favorite sports teams, the anniversaries they always forgot. When their project in Phoenix had a permitting issue at 3 a.m., they didn't call the Sterling helpline. They called my personal cell, and I always answered. I built the entire project management system from scratch. The Sterling method they now taught to new hires was just the David method, a series of protocols, documentation standards, and communication chains I developed over a decade of trial and error. It was the company's central nervous system, and its blueprints existed only in my head and in the manuals I had written, which I knew for a fact no one else had ever bothered to read cover to cover. Then, 2 years ago, Arthur passed away from a sudden heart attack. It was a gut punch to the whole company. In his will, he left his majority stake to his sister, Eleanor, a woman who lived in Connecticut and had never set foot in a construction trailer. And Eleanor had a son, Kyle. Kyle arrived 6 months ago like a conquering hero from a distant land called Business School. He drove a new BMW M5 and parked it in Arthur's old spot. His office was redecorated before he even learned the CFO's name. He replaced Arthur's worn leather chair with something that looked like a prop from a science fiction movie. He filled his walls with framed buzzwords: synergy, innovation, disruption. He saw Sterling Construction not as a legacy to be honored, but as a rusty machine he was destined to upgrade. He saw me as the rustiest part. From our first meeting, he was dismissive. He called my detailed project reports too granular and asked for high-level dashboard analytics. He talked about brand equity and shareholder value. Arthur talked about rebar strength and client trust. Kyle believed the relationships I had built were with the Sterling logo, not with me. He honestly thought he could step into my shoes and these titans of industry wouldn't notice the difference. This was his fatal flaw, an arrogance so profound it blinded him to the reality of how the business actually worked. He believed his pedigree was a substitute for experience. The origin of his undoing came 10 years before he ever walked through the door. It was a meeting in 2014. Mr. Chen from Apex Development was in our office to sign a new 5-year, $80 million contract for a series of new data centers. He had his pen poised over the signature line when he stopped and looked at Arthur. "Arthur," he said, "your company is great, but David is the reason we stay. He's the one who answers the phone on a Sunday. What happens if he gets a better offer and leaves?" Arthur, in his quiet wisdom, didn't hesitate. He looked at me, then back at Chen. "You're right, Frank. A company is just people. Let's make it official." He called in the lawyers. They drafted a new clause. Section 8, subsection C, the Key Personnel Clause. It stated in unambiguous legal language that David Brennan was designated as the key person for the execution of the contract. If I were to cease being the lead project manager for any reason other than documented cause or voluntary resignation with 90 days notice, Apex Development had a 60-day window to terminate their agreement with Sterling Construction without penalty. After Chen left, Arthur clapped me on the shoulder. "It protects them, but it also protects you," he said, his voice gruff. "It makes your value tangible, son. It puts it on paper. Never let anyone forget that." That clause became a standard feature in my negotiations with every one of our major clients. Vanguard, Omnicorp, Meridian, Titan, They all had their own version of Section 8. Subsection C. It was a shield I never thought I'd have to use. Now it was a sword. The stakes were not just professional, they were deeply personal. I'm a single father. My daughter, Sarah, is a sophomore at the University of Texas at Austin. Her tuition is $38,000 a year. My mortgage isn't small. My 401k, heavily invested in sterling stock, was now in the hands of an incompetent fool who was about to drive the company off a cliff. Losing this job wasn't just an insult to my life's work. It was a direct threat to my daughter's future and my own financial security. Kyle wasn't just firing an employee. He was gambling with my family's well-being. The security guards walked me to my desk. They were apologetic. Sorry, Dave. Orders. I knew. I packed my box. A picture of Sarah at her high school graduation. My collection of coffee mugs from project sites around the world. A worn copy of the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius that Arthur had given me. As I was putting my things in the box, I saw my old team watching from their cubicles, a mixture of fear and sympathy on their faces. They knew what a sham this was. When I walked out of that building for the last time, I didn't feel anger. Not yet. That would come later. What I felt was a dead calm. The feeling a soldier gets when the plan of attack becomes clear. Kyle had fired the first shot in a war he didn't even know he was fighting. He had made a critical, unforced error. He assumed I would go quietly. I didn't go home and rage. I didn't drink myself into a stupor. I went to my study, poured a single glass of bourbon, and opened my laptop. My response had to be as methodical and precise as a blueprint for a skyscraper. I logged into the encrypted external hard drive, where I kept personal copies of every major contract I had ever signed. It was a habit I'd learned in the Army. Always have a backup. I opened the 5 key agreements: Apex, Omnicorp, Vanguard, Meridian, Titan. I read Section 8, subsection C in each one. The language was slightly different, but the intent was identical. Ironclad. My first call was not to a client. It was to Marcus Thorne, a lawyer I'd played poker with for years. He was sharp, aggressive, and hated corporate bullies. I explained the situation. There was a long pause on his end, then a low whistle. David, he said, this isn't just a golden parachute. This is a nuke. This is beautiful. My second call was to Bill Peterson. Bill ran Concourse Group, a smaller, hungrier competitor to Sterling. I had competed against him on bids for years and always respected him. He was smart, honest, and an engineer by trade, not a finance guy. He understood how things were actually built. I told him I was now a free agent and that I had a business proposal he might find interesting. We agreed to meet for breakfast the next morning at a quiet diner far from downtown. Meanwhile, Kyle was making his move, just as I predicted he would. At 4:17 p.m., a company-wide email landed. The subject, Strategic Leadership Realignment for a Dynamic Future. It was a masterpiece of corporate nonsense, praising my 19 years of dedicated service while announcing my decision to pursue other opportunities. It went on to say that Kyle would be personally helming our key accounts to drive next-generation synergy. I could almost smell the cologne and arrogance through the screen. He followed it up with personal calls to the 5 CEOs. I know this because 2 of them called me later that evening to ask what the hell was going on. I was polite, but firm. I'm sorry, Frank, I told Mr. Chen. My departure was not my decision. I can't say more at this time, but I wish you and Sterling the very best. I didn't have to fan the flames. Kyle's own blustering incompetence would be gasoline enough. He was telling them he was their new guy, promising them the world, completely oblivious to the fact that their loyalty was to a person, not a brand. He celebrated his victory prematurely, probably posting some garbage on LinkedIn with hashtags like Poncha Leadership and Poncha Growth. He was so sure he had won that he never bothered to check the rules of the game. Over breakfast with Bill Peterson, I laid it all out. Not the contracts, not yet. Just the operational plan. I explained that I could stand up a new major accounts division at his company within a month. I knew the projects, the timelines, the staffing needs, the supply chains. I could bring over my core team of project managers and engineers, the best in the business, who I knew were already polishing their resumes. Bill, I said, I can bring 5 of the most stable, high-margin accounts in the region to your doorstep. All you have to do is give me the platform. Bill listened, stirring his coffee. When I was done, he looked at me. David, why me? You could start your own firm with this. Because I'm a builder, not a bookkeeper, I replied. You have the back office infrastructure. I have the clients and the operational expertise. Together, we can build an empire while Sterling is still trying to figure out how to read a blueprint. He smiled. Draft a proposal, he said. Let's make this happen. The plan was in motion. Phase 1 was complete. Now, I just had to wait for the system to collapse under the weight of its new, incompetent leadership. I didn't have to wait long. The first sign of trouble at Sterling appeared 9 days after my departure. Vanguard Properties had a major zoning variance hearing for a new $40 million office tower. The city planning commissioner, a notoriously difficult man named Henderson, had a question about the soil displacement reports. It was a technicality, but Henderson was a stickler. He was also a man who only ever dealt with me. Kyle, in his infinite wisdom, sent a junior project manager who couldn't answer the question. The variance was tabled for a month, putting the entire project timeline in jeopardy. The CEO of Vanguard left Kyle a voicemail that I was told could strip paint. 2 weeks in, Omnicorp's supply chain for their new distribution center hit a snag. A specific type of German-made facade panel was delayed at the port of Hamburg. It was a $5 million problem that threatened to halt all other construction. I knew the factory manager in Stuttgart, a man named Klaus. I'd shared beers with him at a trade show in Berlin. A single phone call to his mobile would have gotten those panels on the next ship. Kyle's assistant sent an email to the company's general inbox and received a form letter reply stating their query would be answered in 5 to 7 business days. The panels stayed in Hamburg. The calls to my cell phone started as a trickle, then became a flood. Not from the CEOs, but from my old team members, from subcontractors, from suppliers. They were confused and panicked. Dave, no one knows who's supposed to sign this change order. The new guy from corporate doesn't understand the pour sequence. Kyle just tried to renegotiate our rates in the middle of a job. I listened patiently to all of them, offering sympathy, but no solutions. I'm sorry to hear that, Tom. I'm no longer with the company. You'll have to talk to Kyle. It was a form of malicious compliance from a distance. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply letting the natural consequences of my absence play out. The breaking point came 3 weeks after I was fired. It was a Tuesday. Mr. Chen from Apex Development was on site at their massive new corporate campus, a $200 million project that was my proudest achievement. During a critical concrete pour for the foundation of the main tower, a senior engineer noticed a potential issue with the rebar configuration. It was a complex problem that required an immediate, expert decision. A wrong call could compromise the structural integrity of the entire building, a mistake that could cost tens of millions to fix. Chen, a man who did not suffer fools, immediately demanded to speak to the project lead. He called Kyle's office. Kyle was in a 3-hour branding synergy workshop. His assistant, a young woman completely out of her depth, told Mr. Chen that Mr. Sterling was unavailable, but would call him back as soon as possible. That was the moment the dominoes truly began to fall. Chen didn't wait. He hung up, walked to his car, and called my personal cell phone. David, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. I have a problem on site. A big one. I just tried to call your replacement and was told he was in a meeting. I let the silence hang for a moment. "Mr. Chen," I said calmly, "I'm very sorry to hear that. Unfortunately, I no longer work for Sterling Construction as of 3 weeks ago." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the wind whipping around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold as ice. "I see. They did not mention the departure was immediate. Thank you for your time, David. I believe I have all the information I need." He hung up. That was the trigger. The emergency was created. The stage was now set. Over the next few weeks, my lawyer, Marcus, finalized the paperwork. We prepared 5 identical packages. Each contained a formal notification of contract termination, citing the key personnel clause. Each also contained a signed letter of intent to move their business to the Concourse Group, contingent on my leadership of their projects. At Concourse, Bill Peterson and I had finalized our agreement. I was to be the new executive vice president of the Major Accounts Division, with a 25% equity stake in the company. We quietly hired 3 of my most trusted senior engineers from Sterling, who were more than happy to jump from a sinking ship. The 60-day window stipulated in the contracts was closing. We decided to let the notifications land on the day of Sterling Construction's quarterly board meeting. Marcus arranged for 5 separate FedEx couriers to deliver them simultaneously at 10:15 a.m. We wanted maximum impact. The morning of the board meeting, I didn't go to an office. I drove my 1998 Ford F-150, the same truck I'd had for 20 years, out to a lake, Sarah's old fishing spot. I sat on the tailgate, drank a cup of coffee from a thermos, and watched the sun come up. My phone was off. The machine was running on its own now. I could picture the scene perfectly. Kyle, standing at the head of that long mahogany table, the one Arthur had bought at a flea market and refinished himself. He'd be basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. His mother, Eleanor, the majority shareholder, would be looking at him with undeserved pride. The other board members, mostly old friends of her husband's, would be politely listening, waiting for the coffee and pastries. Kyle would be in the middle of his presentation, clicking through a PowerPoint deck filled with meaningless charts and corporate jargon. "Paradigm shift in client engagement," one slide would probably read. He would be explaining how he had personally taken the helm of the company's 5 largest accounts to drive enhanced value and stakeholder return. He would be projecting record revenues for the next quarter, numbers based on projects he had no idea how to manage. He would be at the absolute peak of his confidence, a king addressing his court, completely unaware that the executioner was at the door. Then, at 10:15 a.m., his assistant would enter. She would look pale, her hands trembling slightly as she carried a stack of 5 FedEx envelopes. She would interrupt him mid-sentence. "Mr. Sterling, these just arrived for you. They're all marked urgent and confidential." He would be annoyed at the interruption, but his curiosity would get the better of him. He would take the envelopes, perhaps making a small joke about his own importance. He'd slice open the first one, the one from Apex Development. He'd pull out the single sheet of paper, printed on their heavy, expensive letterhead, and then he would read the words that would end his career. "Pursuant to Section 8, subsection C of our standing agreement, this letter serves as formal notification of our intent to terminate all contracts with Sterling Construction, effective immediately. This decision is triggered by the unwarranted dismissal of the designated key personnel, Mr. David Brennan." His face would drain of color. The smug smile would vanish, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. He would think it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. He'd fumble for the next envelope, the one from Omnicorp. The same words. Then Vanguard, Meridian, Titan. 5 letters, 5 executions, all delivered in the space of 90 seconds. The power in that room would shift so fast it would create a vacuum. His mother would ask what was wrong. The CFO would already be doing frantic calculations on his tablet, his face growing paler with every number he typed. A board member would finally ask, Kyle, what is Section 8, subsection C? Kyle wouldn't be able to answer. He'd looked to the company's general counsel, a man who had been at my firing and had said nothing. The lawyer would suddenly find the grain of the mahogany table intensely fascinating. He knew. He had known all along and had failed to warn his new, arrogant boss. The letters themselves were my statement. They were cold, professional, and utterly devastating. Mr. Chen's letter was particularly pointed. For nearly 2 decades, it read, David Brennan has been more than a contractor. He has been an essential extension of our own team. We consider his departure a material breach of the spirit of our long and successful partnership. Our trust was not in the sterling name, but in the man who gave that name its meaning. The aftermath was swift and brutal. My victory was not in a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet, methodical execution of a well-laid plan. While Kyle was still sputtering in that boardroom, my new office at Concourse Group was already operational. My team was on the phone with the clients, ensuring a seamless transition. We didn't miss a single deadline. At Sterling, the board meeting turned into a bloodbath. Kyle was fired by his own mother before lunch. The news of the 5 client defections hit the trade publications by the end of the day. Sterling Construction's stock, which was privately held but had a book value used for the 401k, dropped by 65% overnight. Kyle Sterling, the Wharton MBA who was going to revolutionize the industry, ended up working as a brand strategist at his father-in-law's Mercedes-Benz dealership in Dallas. His LinkedIn profile was quietly updated, the grand pronouncements about corporate leadership replaced by photos of him standing next to shiny new sedans. The enablers didn't escape. The general counsel was fired for gross negligence. The HR director, Janice, was part of the first round of mass layoffs that began the following week. The board members who had silently endorsed Kyle's takeover were forced to resign by a furious Eleanor, who finally understood the value of the man her son had thrown away. The poetic justice was almost biblical. Kyle, who wanted to steal the credit for my relationships, was left with nothing. The company that bore his family name, a name Arthur had made synonymous with quality, was crippled. Within 6 months, Sterling Construction was forced into a fire sale, acquired for pennies on the dollar by a national conglomerate that strip-mined its remaining assets and dissolved the brand. The Sterling name was erased from the industry. The value, it turned out, was never in the name. It was in the man they had discarded. My terms were not dictated to Sterling. They were agreed upon with my new partner. As executive VP at Concourse Group, I had full autonomy, a handsome salary, and a significant ownership stake that was already worth more than my entire Sterling 401k had been at its peak. We didn't just bring over the 5 legacy clients. We used that incredible momentum to land 3 more major contracts in the first year alone. Concourse Group became the new regional powerhouse, built on the old-fashioned principles of competence and trust. My personal life, the life I had sacrificed so much for, was restored. The constant grinding stress was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of being valued. I worked hard, but I worked smarter. For a company that respected me, I had weekends again. One Friday, I flew down to Austin, unannounced. I showed up at Sarah's dorm and took her and her friends out for the best steak dinner in town. Seeing the surprise and joy on her face was a bigger bonus than any check. I was present. I was there. A few months ago, a trade magazine ran a feature story on the meteoric rise of Concourse Group. They interviewed me for it. They asked me the secret to our success. The article never mentioned Sterling or Kyle by name, but everyone in our world knew the story. They knew who had imploded and why. I still drive my old 1998 Ford F-150. The paint is faded and there's a permanent coffee stain on the passenger seat, but the engine runs like a dream. Some things are built for show, all flash and chrome and empty promises. Others are built to work, to last, to be reliable day in and day out. Kyle had his BMW M5. I have my truck. I know which one I'd rather be. In this business, in any business, some people think value comes from a brand name on the door or a fancy degree on the wall. They're wrong. Real value is built over years, in the mud and the rain, project by project, promise by promise. It is the sum of every phone call answered at 3 a.m., every deadline met, every crisis averted. It's a reputation. And a reputation is something you can't inherit. You have to earn it every single day. And once you've earned it, you must never, ever let anyone take it from you for free. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button and leave a comment letting me know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts about new stories of corporate karma and quiet revenge. I'll see you in the next video.